Season 3 was a time of change for Doctor Who. After a very successful start with its first 2 seasons, the original creators were beginning to move on from the show, with all new people taking it over. It was hectic to say the least. Script editors and producers changed hands multiple times, and companions came and went like nobody's business. Even under the new producers and script editors, they were still having to make stories previously commissioned not under their reign. It was certainly a bit hard in terms of running the show, and surprisingly we still got a pretty good run of serials for the most part in this season. While it certainly isn't as good as the previous 2, it's certainly one to be remembered. Galaxy 4 is an often downtrodden serial which isn't held in high regard by many fans. Personally, I think that's a bit of an injustice, as I really enjoy this story. For a start, the plot is very imaginative and out there. It's one of those episodes which perfectly fits the great spirit of adventure the Hartnell era has. Everything here is just so alien, and that's a good thing. The TARDIS crew are brilliant here. Hartnell, Vicky and Stephen are actually my favourite TARDIS team in the whole of Doctor Who. Unfortunately, they only get 3 stories together on TV, but they do indeed shine here. O'Brien yet again has some amazing chemistry with Hartnell. They do get a lot of time together in this one, and all the scenes they share are magical. Purves does a great job as Stephen despite being separated from the rest of the crew for a lot of the story. His performance is brilliant, just as it needs to be, as there are some really tense scenes that he is in, like when he tries to escape from the Draven ship like in the airlock, or when he tries to use logic to confuse the guard. Needless to say, they carry the serial, and they need to, as this is a very dialogue heavy story being made on the cheap. Fortunately, they do make it work. The Dravens are the matriarchal villains in this story, who are commanded by their leader Marga. She is the only intelligent one, the others are merely test tube soldiers that she's travelling with. She is a ruthless tyrant using fear and lies to control the other soldiers, even killing one and blaming it on the Rills. Despite this, she's not an entirely unsympathetic character, as seen in the amazingly performed speech in episode 3 to her troops. She's clearly under a lot of pressure, and is very lonely out in space with only the test tube soldiers for company. It certainly doesn't excuse her, but it's a very nice shade of nuance that any good piece of writing should have. The Rills are large aliens which have a rather scary guise, which might explain why the Dravens hate them irrationally. They end up helping the TARDIS crew, and the Rill we meet is actually quite charming and likeable, which I think contributes to the overall message of the story, which is, don't be prejudiced. The plot itself is functional, but nothing outstanding. It does get pretty tense towards the end as the planet is about to explode and they struggle to get away in time. However, there's not a whole lot going on here. It still works for me, but a few more elements could be added to it, and it would have made it a lot more entertaining. The pacing is still decent though. I never particularly got bored while I was watching it, and was certainly entertained. Even the direction was quite good from what I can tell from the 1.5 surviving episodes, which is surprising as Derek Martinus isn't usually my favourite director. This was clearly made on the cheap however, as the sets are pretty minimalist and a bit crap, but at least the Chumblies and the Rills look good. Overall, this serial gets a really high good. It certainly has a few issues and more could have been done with the script to improve it, but personally, I have quite a soft spot for it. Mission to the Unknown is the one-part prelude to the Daleks' master plan and does not feature the Doctor in any way. Instead, it stars Edward D. Souza, who plays the character of Mark Corey, and does a remarkable job of taking centre stage for an episode, despite the fact nothing like this has ever been done before at this point in the show. He brings a lot of gravitas to the role and is very enjoyable to watch. The only other major character is Garvey, played by Barry Jackson, who is very wary of Corey and doesn't know him nor what's going on, which makes him the ideal relatable character for the viewer to see through, in essence replacing the role of the companion. The two have a very frosty relationship, which helps build up the tension, which I might add is a brilliant part of this episode. You'll be on the edge of your seat by the end. I must say this is very cleverly done by Terry Nation, as he manages to develop 2 characters while having a good plot and pacing it well in a mere 24 minutes. The setting of the jungle on Kemble is brilliant and is dripping with atmosphere. It's an amazingly constructed set which still looks good to this day. The Varga plants are pretty horrifying too, the way they shuffle in the background constantly, and the fact that one wrong move near them and you slowly become one is an excellent body horror which Doctor Who often does well. There's a feeling of hopelessness to it as well. There's a moment in the story when you realise they're not getting out of this alive, and the deaths are pretty dramatic. Overall, this is a great bit of writing from Terry Nation, and it really helps build up the world of the Daleks' master plan before it begins. It also whets your appetite for some Dalek action which has yet to come. This episode is a high-end great. The Myth Makers is a pure historical in the same vein as the Romans, as in it steers clear from being historically accurate tense drama and instead opts for entertaining comedic antics while being set in a famous historical period. However, rather than actually being based on something we know happened, it loosely follows the plots of two epic poems, the Iliad and the Aeneid. They are meant to be a dramatisation of the Siege of Troy, which is something we're not really sure to have happened. And when I say it loosely follows the books, it's very loose. It does a lot of things differently, characters killed by the wrong person, or in the wrong way, but I can excuse it because the intention isn't to be accurate, but to entertain, which is something it does very well. The TARDIS crew, yet again, are great. You get a very different dynamic for Hartnell to work with here, as he is mostly without his companions, and despite usually being the authoritative figure, is bullied by Odysseus, which is actually fairly entertaining to watch due to the fact that this is a change in dynamic from what usually happens to Hartnell's Doctor. While his performance is good, it's far from his best. It's pretty clear the punishing work schedule of 60s Doctor Who is finally catching up with him, and he is much better in the following serial. Stephen has a pretty good outing here, nothing amazing, but enjoyable, especially his interaction with Vicky, which is good as always. Vicky is great in this serial and probably gets the most screen time out of all of the main cast, but I can't help but wish she had more as this was her final episode on the show. Her exit has some positives and negatives. I do buy her relationship with Troilus and I did enjoy watching it develop over the course of the episodes. However, what I don't buy is that she'd want to stay in the ancient world, especially as somebody who comes from a time even more in advance of our own. It'd be a really hard life where she'd be persecuted for being a woman, and I'm sure the character would know this, so it just doesn't ring with me. Originally it was planned for her exit to be in the next serial, which would have went the same way that Katarina did, but with Vicky in her place, which in my opinion would have been a much more effective exit if absolutely heartbreaking. It did also annoy me that she didn't get a proper final scene with Hartnell's Doctor. It's all done off screen, which is really sad as these two characters and actors got on so well, and I really want to see what their final goodbyes would have been like. These are probably my biggest criticisms of the serial, and they really are a detriment to it. The plot itself isn't too much to write home about. After all, it is just retelling the events from a poem, but with different lines and some new characters. However, it's the character interaction and dialogue which really stand out here. They are all very distinct, and most of them, even the brutal ones, are quite likeable. The best out of the supporting characters in my opinion has to be Paris, played by Barry Ingham. He's a bit of a weasel, but not always in a bad way, and he definitely has a kind heart helping defend Vicky from Cassandra. He definitely got the most laughs out of me too. His dialogue is extremely witty and Ingham delivers it with superb comedic timing. Of course you have Odysseus, played by Ivor Salter, who plays the role brilliantly. The character is definitely written more like how he is in the Aeneid, being a greater bastard, and it's bloody entertaining to watch. Salter does callously violent but charming very well. Even when he's laughing about something awful, I couldn't help but laugh with him. The rest of the side characters are all very good too, and it's a testament to Cotton's superb writing when Troy is sacked in episode 4, and you genuinely feel an emotional connection with them due to the great characterization many in Priam's court receive. The episode ends on a very bittersweet note, with Troy being destroyed, but Aeneas rescuing some of the Trojans to go and build a new Troy. Unfortunately, as so little survives of this serial, I can't comment on the more technical aspects like direction, which is a shame. The incidental music is rather odd, but it works decently. I think it probably sounds stranger than it actually is just because of the very low quality sound recording, which is all that survives. On top of it, very few telesnaps are available, but that's not a slight on the serial of course, just something I thought that was worth mentioning. Overall, despite some aspects of this serial annoying me a fair bit, it still receives a great, just for having some incredibly charming and witty writing by Donald Cotton, with some excellent characterisation to boot. It got a fair few laughs out of me too. While it's not the Romans level of hilarity, it's certainly a riot to watch. I'm going to be a little brief with the Daleks' master plan, as I feel I need to do a soulless review to do such a long and diverse serial such as this justice. I'm going to try and talk a bit generally here so you can get my overall thoughts on the serial without me going too in depth. Performances in this story are brilliant. It's really an all-star cast in Doctor Who terms, getting actors such as Kevin Stoney, Peter Butterworth, Jean Marsh and Nicholas Courtney on board. They all play brilliant characters that are very likeable in their own ways, not to mention very memorable, despite not all of them getting that much screen time in the grand scheme of things. They're very well remembered characters. Sarah even getting her own Big Finish audios. This also contains one of Hartnell's best performances yet. All of his lines are delivered with such gravitas and passion. On top of it, the Doctor is very brave in this story, despite all the things that are happening to him. You have to remember that back then, the Doctor was a much more fallible character than he is now, which arguably is actually more effective. And because he's actually dealing with it very well here, it serves to make the character really likeable. Peter Purves is also really into his role as Stephen by this time and puts out his best performance so far, even if he surpasses it in the very next serial. It's clear, due to how big this story is in more ways than one, that people are putting their all into it. The plot and the pacing are bloody amazing, at points at least. Unfortunately, parts 6 to 11 are of a distinctly lower quality than the rest of the story, which kill the pace and atmosphere quite a bit. Parts 6, 10, 11 are excusable, but 7, 8 and 9 barely have anything to do with the actual story, and you would lose next to nothing if they weren't even part of it. However, parts 1 to 5 and 12 are the closest Doctor Who will ever get to perfection. It's really tense and keeps you on the edge of your seat, not to mention lots of really likeable characters don't make it, and it effectively tugs at the viewer's emotions. It's a really dark one too. Some of the deaths are quite graphic, and there's one point where you see 2 limp bodies floating around space for about 30 seconds. It almost kills you how much this part of the story drives you to the edge of your seat. Not a moment is wasted, and it's thoroughly entertaining. The standout scene for me has to be the one where they meet Daxter. It hits quite hard, so does most of episode 4 in fact, which I'd argue is the best soulless episode of Doctor Who ever made. Not to mention, the direction from Douglas Camfield is superb. He shows off the beautiful looking sets while keeping the tension high at the same time, with some help from the brilliant Tristram Cary score. The Kemble jungle in the set has to be the best. It all looks completely real, and I'd argue it's better than what CGI could manage. Great job for the budget they were on. To conclude, despite its faltering in the middle, the Daleks' master plan still deserves to be recognised as a masterpiece of Doctor Who, at least in my opinion. When Doctor Who is written that well, I can go some way to forgive some of its shortcomings, even if it's a bit of a letdown, that it can't all be as good as the best parts of it. Watch out for the ending, however. It'll leave you gutted inside. The massacre is an often overlooked historical, and I can't for the life of me understand why, despite it being missing. It's a classic bit of intense drama, and it's a taste of what the Wilds and Tosh era might have been like had they gotten the opportunity to do the things they wanted to do with the show. It's a really powerful character piece that portrays the horrors of religious persecution with ease, and isn't afraid to tell it as it was. Peter Purves is on fire in this serial. It's easily his best outing as Stephen, except for maybe the audio return of the Rocket Men. For the most part, it's his show too, as the Doctor goes missing for a great chunk of it, yet he carries the show so effectively without him. This is of course assisted by the side characters we see, who are all written in a way that allow the viewer to fully understand the historical context of the period, as unlike most historicals, it's not based on a hugely well-known event. Because of this great characterization and how, through the eyes of Stephen, we the audience manage to empathise with all the characters, it makes the ending that much more powerful and saddening. It's a really strong scene where Stephen almost leaves the TARDIS in frustration at the Doctor. It's a great reminder that the Doctor is alien and can be, from our point of view, a callous arsehole. Hartnell shines resolutely when he's given that scene alone in episode 4, and it might be one of his best moments. The plot itself is very intriguing and informative, if a little complicated. If you want to understand what the hell is going on, you need to be paying absolute attention to this serial, as there's a lot of characters and dynamics. It really doesn't help that it's a missing one too. While you can manage with a reconstruction, it's a bad idea to listen to this in a purely audio form. What I like about it is how it's not afraid to show religion's dark side, which I imagine would have still been taboo on 60s television, but nonetheless it does, in a really effective way too. You can feel the friction build up to the eventual massacre throughout the story, which shows a real understanding of why this happened. Overall, The Massacre is a great story and is on the high end of that spectrum too, due to its really tight and effective writing. It could possibly do with some things in the plot being a bit more clear. For example, Hartnell playing a member of the clergy did confuse me the first time round, and I wasn't sure that that was the effect it was intended to have. Either way, it's certainly one that deserves to be remembered. As unlikely as it is, I'd be overjoyed if it was found or animated. The arc is quite a departure from the previous two serials, and that's probably a good thing since you can have too much serious dark drama in one go. It's a fun bit of sci-fi fluff with some ideas which were quite fresh at the time. It looks into the very far future of humanity and how we go on, which is something that's been done to death by this time, but I'm sure it was new and exciting back in 1966. This is the introductory story for Dodo, who certainly isn't the most complex or developed of characters. I honestly struggle to name a single character trait she has. However, contrary to most fans who despise her, I think Dodo is a fun character, not well written, but enjoyable to watch. There's not a moment where she particularly grates on me, which is usually what puts me off some companions. The performance of the main cast is okay, nothing special, definitely a step down from the prior two episodes. Perhaps this is due to the fact that they were not exactly surrounded by the greatest actors like they were. There's nothing particularly wrong with the acting here, mind, it's just fairly flat and unmemorable. The same goes for most of the human characters. I do quite like the monoids, however. They're very fun to watch and honestly, they're characterised better than the humans despite having names like number 1, number 2 and number 9, etc. The story had a very interesting structure. They first land on the ship containing the last of the humans and monoids and cure the virus which Dodo brings accidentally, which was actually a cold. I liked that it put some science in there and it certainly made for some tense viewing. They leave at the end of episode 2 but accidentally return 700 years later, which results in one of my favourite cliffhangers. I like how they get to see what happens after the TARDIS crew leave and what the consequences there might be. It's something that's been done since for the first time here. I dare say I'd like this kind of thing more often, especially if it's like what happened in series 1 of New Who in Bad Wolf. The plot is nicely structured and decently written, it certainly kept me entertained throughout. The arc is quite a nice looking one too. There's some great sets and direction, they even managed to get an actual elephant for one of the first scenes of the story, which is a novelty. There's some decent model work too. The statue that the humans and monoids make does actually seem as tall as it's meant to be. Of course, there's some invisible creatures too again this season, albeit more friendly than the Myron beasts. To conclude, the arc isn't anything special, but it's a damn fun watch nonetheless, and it's why I award the rating of a good. If you're looking for a bit of Hartnell fun and adventure, look no further than the arc. The Celestial Toymaker is one that's often criticised for having a great idea but squandering it due to the lack of Hartnell. While there are certainly some merits to this point of view, I still think this serial is a bloody good one. The concept is an interdimensional being called the Toymaker catches people and makes them play his deadly games, and if they lose, he wins them and keeps them as his toys. It's pretty sinister stuff. Script editor Donald Tosh allegedly had to take over the writing from Brian Hayles because he got too scared while writing it, according to Tosh himself. I'd really like to see the original draft by Hayles since it affected him so strongly. The main cast are mixed here. Obviously Hartnell isn't in it much as they were trying to give him a break due to the punishing work schedule of Doctor Who in the 60s. Even so, I must complain that other than episode 4 his performance is very phoned in, which is a shame. Purves and Lane are pretty good as Stephen and Dodo here. There's two people who hate cheaters, they certainly get outraged at the goings on by some of the Toymaker's servants. The side characters here are strange to say the least, which makes sense as the Toymaker's realm is full of childlike nonsense. The only ones I really liked were the King and Queen of Hearts, who were really fun to watch, and Cyril the naughty schoolboy who was the final contestant against the TARDIS crew. Cyril is a huge bastard and it's really enjoyable to watch. He cheats, he swindles and annoys the shit out of the pair, and I'd be lying to you if I said I didn't love every single moment of it. A big hand to Peter Stevens for such a delightful performance. Of course, I can't commend Michael Gough enough for his brilliant outing of the Toymaker. I'm glad as a character we've seen return to Big Finish, and he is a very memorable one. The plot structure consists of 4 of the Toymaker's very sinister games, 1 per episode. The first is a blindfolded obstacle course where they're against a couple of clowns. It's okay, not entirely thrilling, but I must say it's enjoyable to watch when Stephen and Dodo find out the clowns are cheating. The next game is much better. Basically there's 8 chairs and only one of them won't kill you. To win, you sit on the right chair. It's as fun as it sounds, and I have to say this is the second best of the bunch for certain. The third episode is just a mess however, and feels really rushed. Technically the game in this is the dancing floor, but it's not very good, and it's only really in at the very end. For most of the episode, they're just looking for a key in this very bizarre kitchen. It did get a couple of laughs out of me, but overall this is by far the weakest episode of the lot. Episode 4, however, makes up for this tenfold by being the best episode with the best game. It's like playing a board game, except for you are the playing piece, and moving off the spaces onto the floor results in a rather violent death, which really gives it a sinister edge. Of course, it's the one with Cyrillin too, who as I said is an irresistible bastard, which makes it all the more satisfying that after a bit of swindling, just before he wins, he is the cause of his own destruction. The costumes in this episode are brilliant. They're all very vibrant and the story begs to be in colour. However, the sets do have something to be desired. They function well enough, but it's clearly a studio. Not that I can blame them, as they were trying to create a bizarre dimension on a minuscule budget, but sometimes it just looks like a mishmash of things they could find. Bill Sellers does do some very good direction here though. Nothing special, but admirable, especially considering the limitations. Overall, this story receives a very high-end good. It's nothing spectacular despite it being a brilliant idea, and I do hope it's picked up for TV again at some point, especially with all the wonderful things you can do today with special effects to really bring the Toymaker's domain to life. This might be one of the most heavily criticised serials in the Hartnell era. It was hated on broadcast and still receives poor acclaim today. Inez Lloyd got such cold feet from producing it, he actually stopped pure historicals from being made soon after. However, for the life of me, I can't understand why this is. It's so much fun. The regulars are clearly having a lot of fun here. After all, the Wild West was a big thing back then, as westerns were still very much in fashion. This is probably Dodo's best story, she actually gets something to do rather than just tagging along with the TARDIS crew, and Jackie Lane is clearly having a great time doing it. Hartnell again gets to show off some of his comedic prowess, even if it's not as much as in the previous comedic episodes. There's some very funny moments here, especially when the Doctor gets mistaken for Doc Holliday. All the actors play it so well and it certainly got a hearty laugh out of me. As for the minor characters, they're all pretty good, some more memorable than others. One in particular that was basically pantomime was one of the Clanton brothers who stutters all the time. Doc Holliday had to be my favourite of the minor characters. His slippery charm and dubious morals always leave you wondering whether you can trust him or not. He does some good things, but he's also kind of the bad guy who causes all the problems. It's a lovely bit of nuance, which is always welcome in my book. The Purves are the lawmen and are also very good, and again fairly nuanced, as they are just trying to protect people, but the Purves kind of go off the deep end towards the end when their brother is killed by the Clantons. The story itself is based off the gunfight of the OK Corral, which if you didn't know is a very famous event in the history of the Wild West. The build-up to it is very good, and you can feel the tension rising ever higher throughout the story until it finally culminates in part 4, which has the actual gunfight itself. It all feels very natural, and the pacing is pretty much spot on. Everything is in place really, the characters, their motivations, it's all in place, nothing feels like it's happening for no reason here, which is really showing the writing prowess of Donald Cotton. The direction here is stellar. There's some really good shots and the set looks like a fairly convincing western town despite the awful American accents by British actors. The gunfight in particular is kept very tense by director Rex Tucker, and aesthetically it's a very pleasing story. One of the biggest complaints levelled at it, however, is that the Ballad of the Last Chance Saloon is played far too often. While there is certainly some truth to that, and it probably wasn't the best choice, I personally quite like it. It really helps the atmosphere of the serial, and I think it fits the western theme. Overall, The Gunfighters is a very fun story. While you shouldn't expect a masterpiece by any stretch of the imagination, it's a story that doesn't take itself too seriously and is written solidly at the level it wants to be. A ranking of a great for sure. The Savages is a story which isn't often talked about by many fans, which is obviously the fate of many fully missing episodes. But I'd argue that this is more the exception than the rule, and this certainly gets nearly the least attention from fans than any story, which is certainly odd for one with a companion exit. The main cast are very mixed here. Lane and Hartnell don't get a whole lot of screen time, which is a shame, especially as they're both very close to leaving the show. Purves, however, gets a great outing here, which is only right as it is his last story. The performance is great and Stephen is given a lot to do. His exit is actually a very good one, certainly a lot different from most companion exits, and it's one that Big Finish have built upon greatly in their Companion Chronicles range. The other characters here are fairly forgettable. Some of them are decent I suppose, but nothing special. Jano is quite good mind, at least in the last half of the story, but he's pretty bland before then. The only actor of note for me is Ewan Solon, who has a very nice voice, but again, the performance is nothing spectacular. This story is very standard. The idea isn't particularly original or interesting. One positive thing I will say about it, however, is that it's got a good message against exploitation of a lower class or caste of people, which is universally relevant to everybody throughout history, and that's unfortunately the fate of groups of people in nearly all societies. This still doesn't prevent it from dragging on quite a bit. It just isn't that interesting a concept to keep the viewer intrigued, especially as there's basically no mystery left after episode 1. That's not to say it can't be enjoyable, because it can be. Despite hating it on my first viewing, I found myself at least enjoying the story on a very basic level. Unfortunately, there's no way to tell how good the direction is, but judging from the stills taken and the fact that it's by Christopher Barry, it was probably quite good. I love the incidental music too. I'd like to see this style of violin music in other stories as it really does help build up the tension while being pleasant to listen to as well. The Savages is a mediocre serial. The writing is solid, but the ideas just aren't very interesting, nor are the characters outstanding in any way. At least Stephen got a good exit. The War Machines is a great finale to Season 3. It's almost scary how much the show has changed since Galaxy 4. It's the first time since An Unearthly Child that the TARDIS crew has properly landed in modern day Earth, and it's almost a calling to the future of the show as it feels very much like a Pertwee serial, or at least a precursor to it, with the Doctor fighting a man-made threat on Earth with the army. Either way, it's certainly a good advertisement for it. William Hartnell shines as usual. His interactions with all the characters are very fun to watch, and the way he stands up to the War Machine in particular is a great moment for his Doctor. This is Lane's last story as Dodo, and her exit is really bad. She's hypnotised by Roten, which she admittedly plays quite well, but once the Doctor stops the mind control, she's sent off to the country and is never seen again. Of course, here we have the introduction of Ben and Polly, who are a breath of fresh air for the show. It's a TARDIS team with a much different dynamic from the previous ones, and most of the time, they're enjoyable to watch. They both put in a great performance, especially when Polly is controlled by Wotan and is labouring and trapped with Ben in the warehouse. Wills does a very good performance whilst being possessed, which is all the more frightening due to how distraught Ben gets, which is brilliantly acted by Craze. There's quite a few characters in this story, but the most memorable is Sir Charles. He's kind and willing to take people at their word for things if it's urgent, which is a refreshing departure from Doctor Who's usual higher-up characters who are often aloof and untrusting. The plot is a very captivating one. I mean, it basically invents the internet for one thing, as all the major computers linking up on C-Day is just that. However, C-Day isn't actually the focus of the story. It's to do with the computer which will be the central organiser of all computers, Wotan. Basically, it's a self-thinking machine that on C-Day will control all the computers and the weapons controlled by those computers to help create peace. However, it becomes self-aware and begins building machines to enslave humanity to create a more efficient world. Yes, it's just fucking Terminator but 18 years prior. I suppose it's possible that the creators of that film were influenced by it, but I find that unlikely considering the War Machines was still missing at the time, and I assume the Terminator was made by Americans. Either way, it shows how ahead of its time Doctor Who could sometimes be, with a very scientific idea which makes it a really interesting watch. The direction here is really good, and I'd expect nothing less from Michael Ferguson, who is one of the show's best directors. There isn't much in the way of incidental music, and when there is, it's just short snippets of stock stuff, which is a shame. However, when the stock stuff is used, it's very effective, especially the really discombobulating off-key tune that plays when Wotan is hypnotising people. It makes it quite eerie. Wotan in general has a great design, and despite being a stationary bit of set, it has a very unnerving presence. You can't help but feel like it's watching. The war machine design is very good. I would have expected less due to the budget, but it does look quite menacing, if a bit inefficient, but I suppose Wotan was meant to be using 1960s technology. The War Machines is a very pleasant story to watch. It has some really creative ideas for its time, as well as being a nice slice of 1960s culture. It's going to get a grade. I don't feel it quite goes far enough with its ideas to be considered a masterpiece, but it's a lovely serial nonetheless. And that is season 3. While it's not quite as good as the previous 2 seasons, I still think it holds its own with a pretty consistent run of episodes. It's a shame it goes pretty underrated by most fans, probably due to it being mostly missing. And that is all for today's video, and I shall see you back next time in another one. And please tell me your opinions on season 3 in the comments.